Hello and welcome to In Solidarity. This is our first time that we're trying to go video, which would explain why I look like I'm sitting inside the sort of usher booth of a large theater, because that is in fact where I am right now. However, at some point we will have an actual a podcast studio, but for now we are incredibly excited to have as our first video guest, Danny Sriskandarajah. Danny is the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation, and also the author of this great new book, Power to the People, Use Your Voice, Change the World. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm really, really excited to have you on this show because when we started In Solidarity, the key question that we were sort of asking was, why is it that everyone feels so exhausted right now? Why is it that people keep saying things like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world rather than imagine the end of capitalism? And and I felt that this is also a moment where a lot of people feel really disempowered right now. And by that, I don't just mean people on the left of the spectrum, because if the US election had gone a few points the other way, it would have been people on the right feeling incredibly, incredibly disempowered, which led me to believe that there's something broken here. And then I picked up your book and I was like, all right, this is a book that I can actually think with. So thank you for writing this book. Usually I like to start with just saying, what made you want to write this book?
Well, it really is about the fact that I too feel like things are broken and feel sort of despondent at times, seeing what's happening around us. And for me, the book was about trying to sort of remind myself why it's important to be hopeful, especially in moments like this. And I suppose the backstory and the original title for the book wasn't going to be Power to the People. It was going to be The Century of the Citizen, because about 15 years or so ago, I started working at Civicus, the Global Alliance for Civil Society, which represents citizens' organizations all around the world. It was headquartered in South Africa. And when I started working there, it felt like such a positive phase of human history, right? We'd had the Arab revolutions, the internet was allowing us to organize and mobilize, the Occupy movement was challenging the way that capitalism worked. And I really thought this was going to be the century of the citizen, that, we'd stop being subjects of rulers and chiefs and monarchs, and we were also going to stop being consumers, and instead we were now going to emerge as citizens, connected and empowered and able to organize and mobilize. And the last decade or so has really seen a sort of reversal almost in every aspect of civic life and almost everywhere in the world. But yet, I think we can reverse that. I still do think this can be the century of the citizen. And I really do remain hopeful, because I think we can change these very very systems, politics, economics, the way the digital world works. All of those are human creations. And so therefore, just as we've got ourselves into this mess, we can get ourselves out of this mess. And I wanted to write a book that sort of reminded me, and I hope reminds readers, about how it is possible to reimagine a radically better future.
Early in your book, you make this very interesting point where you say that society spends a huge amount of time fixating on the state. Like, what's the state doing? What is the government doing? And then we also spend a huge amount of time fixating on the market. The market is consuming us. The market is making us wage slaves. And and one of the reasons I think I would sometimes think myself into a hole was because I would be like, oh my God, the state is incredibly oppressive. And then I would be like, oh my God, the market is incredibly extractive. And what I found interesting is how early in the book you posit, I'd rather not posit, but remind us of this third space, which you kind of call this network of communities. You call it a taproot. At some point, you call it a fungal mushroomable network. Um, Talk to me about this.
Yeah, well, I mean, that fixation, was so abundantly clear in the last year in particular, right? So, there were so many elections all around the world, the biggest year for democracy, with several billion of us going to the polls. And, as a world, and certainly in those countries where there were elections, we obsessed about what was going to happen. And I have nothing against that. It's important that we have orderly, effective democracy, that people, we change the people in power and hold them to account. But politics and political life, and particularly civic life, how we sort of express our political identities, go much deeper, well beyond the sort of electoral moments. And in some way, I worry that by fixating on the sort of drama of elections, we are sort of willfully negligent or willfully blind to how weak the foundations of democracy, the sort of rest of democracy, have become. And similarly with the market, you're right, we fixate on, it's not even, I wish we'd fixate more on wage slavery. We fixate on our share prices and returns in the short term. Or, here we are in the UK where we're fixating on whether the economy grew by 0.1% or shrunk by 0.1% in aggregate GDP terms. I think the lesson surely is that it doesn't really matter whether the aggregate economy grows or falls. What matters more to more people is what's happening to their lives. Or do they feel more secure? What's happening to their communities? What's happening to the planet we live in? And so a cynic would say that these are, the way that particularly mainstream media obsesses about these things, they're important, but they're not as important, I think, as they're made to be, distracts us from the fact that lived lives, lived experience for the vast majority of people in many parts of the world is becoming less secure, that the sort of very communities that we're part of, the very networks of civic life are frail, are being chipped away at, and in some cases are being crushed by autocrats and economic elites that they collude with. And so, yes, it is a reminder, I hope, that we really should pay much more attention to the sort of undergrowth of how we as citizens connect with each other, in that other space outside the state and outside the market, what we call civil society.
So talk to me about the undergrowth, because you write about it actually very movingly. You talk about these seemingly tenuous but surprisingly strong connections and communities that form, and you've kind of spent a large part of your working life working directly with these communities, participating in these communities. You were born into community action in a sense. Talk to us about some of the things you've seen and how they've shaped you or made you think differently, or what you've learned in this.
Yeah, I think one thing I learned, particularly in sort of putting pen to paper, or whatever the modern keyboard equivalent is how profoundly my own outlook on life was shaped by the fact that, I was born in Sri Lanka just before the Civil War. We left just as the war was starting, and a lot of my childhood was shaped by the fact that we were Sri Lankan Tamils, a minority that felt persecuted in Sri Lanka, and a lot of my childhood was shaped by political activism to raise sort of concern, especially around the world, about what was going on in Sri Lanka, which felt like a sort of forgotten war for especially in the West. And so a lot of my childhood was about, trying to raise awareness of human rights abuses, or, trying to get politicians and others to intervene to build peace in Sri Lanka. And that, I think, was, so important, because that shaped my sort of worldview about the fact that sort of trying to change the world was an important part of who I have become. And that's, I think, an important part of the reason why I remain hopeful. Like, a lot of people ask me, well, how come you be so hopeful? And I said, well, for me, hope is different from optimism, because an optimist, in my view, is someone who thinks the world will get better. Someone who's hopeful knows the world can get better and spends a lot of their time trying to make it better. And so there was a sort of one learning from writing this book, is just to tap into this idea that, there's much about the world that needs changing, and each of us will have a, completely different set of issues that we are passionate about, we're angry about, we're indignant about, we're inspired by. But it's really important that we pursue those passions and try to address the frustrations we feel about the world. And that brings me to the other learning, which is that if each of us does more of that, speaks out when we see human rights abuses, or stand up for marginalized and vulnerable communities, or simply volunteers in our community to provide services that are not currently available to marginalized people or whatever else. That these that sort of the being in community, volunteering in a sports club, all the way to going on a protest march, all of that is hugely important for nurturing not just community but buttressing democracy. And I think that's the other learning, that's the sort of undergrowth bit that, we often, again, we focus on the sort of the mushrooms that pop up from time to time, the mass protest or the revolution, or the arrests of someone, who dares to speak out. That's all important, but they're manifestations. They're the mushrooms that pop up out of this sort of undergrowth of civic life that is all about us wherever we look. And one of the joys of writing this book was, my editor was very clear. So, find me stories of how people are doing things. And one of the joys of the book was I didn't even have to look very far. I mean, I'm talking to you from sitting in my home in Southwest London. All around me, I see amazing manifestations of civic life. In the park, a couple hundred meters away on a Saturday morning, is Britain's largest volunteer-run football club for kids. Just outside the supermarket, I saw just yesterday some volunteers raising or seeking donations for a food bank. Sadly, here we are in one of the world's richest, most prosperous countries, and levels of hunger and poverty are rising, but citizens are trying to do something about that. And so that's another learning that, I too, probably because of the way that, because I'm a sort of professional bit of civil society, have, I think, neglected all the amazing, wonderful, sometimes chaotic ways in which we as social animals, as civic animals, come together.
I've been thinking a lot about this after I read your book, because I was thinking about this idea of the fact that people say, the problem with people on the left, the problem with progressives is that we kind of refuse to come together. There's a lot of hair splitting. And then separately, you hear another conversation about people saying everything is so intensely politicized these days. There's no common ground. But when you think about a running club, or you think about there's a pickup basketball game very close to my house where I go and play in the summers every week, I know a fair bit about some of the people that I play with. I have literally no idea about their politics.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And I sense that in reading your book and reading about community actions and volunteer groups where you're united at that moment around one specific thing, which is our core politics today is that you have to run every Sunday. Um, that allows for what I guess these days thinking of as contingent communities, that communities that come together around a specific thing, they do that specific thing, but the bonds that they build in doing that specific thing go beyond that specific thing. Does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense to me, and I think that, and I love your running club example, because again, one of the I do park runs, which are in the UK and many other parts of the world, every Saturday morning, entirely volunteer run. Hundreds of thousands of people in hundreds of locations around the world take part in a run, and as you say, it's not a sort of political action, but it's so hugely important. And I think comes back to the sort of theory of civil society, which is there. Of course, a vocal, independent civil society is important as a check or a balance against the abuse of power. These are human rights groups that stand up to and speak truth to power. It's open democracy, which highlights the abuse of the freedom of expression, exposes where human rights are being imposed. That's also all hugely important. But then there's this other bit, which is the sort of what I suppose sociologists would call bridging capital, that that every society needs the glue to hold it together. And these sorts of activities that we do, sometimes with our neighbors, sometimes with strangers, are hugely important in keeping communities together. And one of the things I fear is that on the first of those, on the sort of political bits of civil society or independent civil society, that's under attack like never before by autocrats or even Democrats who don't like being criticized, are shutting organizations down, are arresting protesters, or killing investigative journalists, as you will know better than anyone.
In your book, I really read your book, man. You you have this moment which I think is a really interesting insight, where you say that a lot of the kind of roiling and the kind of rise of populism and authoritarianism and the sort of, nihilistic politics is in some ways a sign that the ruling elites are losing the power to rule in the old way. And I think this is a good distinction because, as you say, it is a game of cat and mouse, right, between society and the state. And and when we look at, say, Donald Trump coming in and saying, I'm going to burn this place down, and large numbers of people just saying, do it. Here's the match, do it. And 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 it's terrifying because, of course, the people that this particular nihilistic force have decided to attack are the most vulnerable in many ways. But when we think back to the original insight, which is that an elite has lost the power to rule in the old way and now is finding new ways, and of course is immediately reaching for the most convenient route for power, which is consolidation. But I think in your writings, there seems to be this sense that each of these states is finally unstable, that will give way to something.
Yeah, look, I was watching the inauguration of Donald Trump a few weeks ago, and like many people, I was terrified. There was the man holding the match, about to set fire to the institutions that that prop up the American Republic, surrounded by three of America's richest men, India's richest man, uh, Europe's richest man, and you couldn't make up a sort of a caricature of a collusion between political and economic elites. When I worked at Oxfam, we used to publish this research on wealth inequality, and when that first report came out in 2014, the calculation was 64 of the world's richest people had the same amount of wealth as half of the world's population put together. And then every year, the report sort of updates that figure. 64 became 40, became 30, became 16, became 12, became 8, And though I think the sort of the billionaires in the Trump inauguration came, their combined assets was about just under the wealth of half of all Americans. So they're extracting at eye-watering rates, at unprecedented rates. They're extracting value from all of us, and then they're colluding, right? They're colluding with never before. You might say has political power and economic power been so closely aligned as we're seeing it in America at the moment. Although as you've seen in India, there have been plenty of rich Indians who've come very close to the current government, and it's deeply unsustainable. And I think some of them know it. I mean, we, for example, at the New Economics Foundation work with a group called Patriotic Millionaires, who are actually rich people, millionaires, who are calling for higher taxes and more redistribution because they see that this is deeply unsustainable. This group, Patriotic Millionaires, their first report was called Taxes Not Pitchforks, because they said if we don't start to recalibrate the sort of economic system, it will be pitchforks. There will be a sort of complete breakdown in the social fabric. And so in this jeopardy that we're witnessing, I think that's where the sort of creative potential, if you will, of reimagining the way that our systems can work comes. And I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know who will make the biggest difference. But I suppose the overarching sort of lesson from the book is we've all got to have a go at trying to drive the change we want, to sort of deliver the world we want to see.
One of the things that's great about your book is that there are all of these examples, right? And I'm not saying give me a kind of matrix of what makes a people's movement successful. I'm saying just tell us what you've seen. Like, what have you seen? Analyze it as deeply as you feel like. But I think what the book is also telling us is, of course, it seems so simple that I don't want to believe in it, that most things end in failure, but the ones that succeed really succeed, and you kind of have to have a vision at the center of it and then just go for it. But tell me the ones that you've seen that have got you genuinely excited about the world that's coming after.
Yeah. Well, the one that excites me clearly is the one that I opened the book with, which is I lived in South Africa when I was working for Civicus, and one of the reasons we wanted to live in South Africa was to witness this sort of remarkable thing that where, apartheid was overthrown largely through peaceful citizen action. And, it was amazing just to think through the sort of histories of some of those key characters in the anti-apartheid movement and the tactics they used. Because most of them, you wouldn't have, they wouldn't, none of them was destined to be an anti-apartheid leader, to be president, or to be the head of the trade union movement, or whatever else it is. But they all tried, and they must, for decades, they must have thought, this is impossible. I mean, that this is, we're just paying this sort of huge price through the struggle, and nothing is moving. But yet it happened, and it's because of a whole range of things. And again, I don't need to dissect that particular frog because many others have. But I think to me, it's a reminder of the fact that each of those people, each bit of that struggle played its part. The other story that inspires me is the one of Rosa Parks, which I didn't know enough about until I started reading the book. So, many of us, I suspect, know the story of this young seamstress refusing to get up from her seat in a bus in Alabama in 1955, I think, because the bus driver told her to go back to the back of the bus because she was sitting in seats assigned to white people. Now, in some ways, that is a remarkable act of bravery by one person. But in other ways, it was a story that we should pay a lot of attention to, or the backstory we should pay a lot of attention to. Because Rosa Parks had, years before that particular moment, attended a 2-week retreat at something called the Highlander Center, which is still around and is an amazing place which brings together citizens and people from all sorts of backgrounds to talk about how to change the world. And in those 2 weeks was one of the first times Rosa says in her autobiography that she met white people, and she was, realized there were actually white people out there who wanted to tear down America's racist system. So, she was invested in, if you will. There was a nurturing of, it didn't happen that day on the bus, didn't happen by accident. There was a confidence building, there was a connection, there was an empowerment, if you will. And so lesson one for me, and a lot of what I still try to do, is sort of make sure that we're nurturing that undergrowth. And second, of course, there was an economic strategy. And, we have to get real about the role of economics in so much of what we see in the world. It's not by accident that Elon Musk wants to be so close to Donald Trump, right? But there was an economic strategy because alongside the legal strategy that was there put in place to defend Rosa Parks in the court system, there was also a boycott by African Americans of the entire bus system in Montgomery that lasted well over a year and really hurt the economic interests of capitalists and owners of those bus companies in that part of the world. And there was a moral strategy because there was that young pastor in Montgomery who'd just got his first job out of university, who saw Rosa Parks and sort of built a sort of campaign that came to national prominence. And, he talked about the fact that this wasn't just about a struggle of one woman against a racist bus system. It was actually about the sort of the moral heart of what it means to be American. And he managed to lift a political, a legal, an economic strategy into a moral one. And of course, that was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Through your book, I see a strain of unabashed internationalism, let me call it that, where consistently at various points you talk about the power of people finding common cause with people halfway around the world. It's something that, for instance, openDemocracy is premised on this idea that we think it's important for the whole world to talk to the whole world. But often when asked to actually articulate what it is, I falter. So you're the man with the book. Like, what is it that you think? Where do you think this power lies? Where do you think this power comes from? What is this magic?
Yeah. So part of it is, I am very much an internationalist, and it's probably because of my upbringing, and I've now lived, I think, in 6 countries in 5 continents, and so there's a sort of an international perspective that has just sort of happened for me. But what's interesting, and again fascinating in researching the book, is that there's growing evidence to suggest particularly young people are also far more international or global in their outlook than we often think. Lots of evidence to suggest that, I think, a plurality of Chinese, Indians, South Africans under the age of 40 think of themselves more as a citizen of the world than a citizen of their own country. For the rest of human sort of civilization, will be much more local and far more global. And the nation state as we know it becomes far less important a sort of organizing unit in politics. And that's where I think we also have an opportunity to sort of think through how might we make global decision-making more democratic? Because right now, it's like almost the least, like you couldn't imagine a less democratic way of organizing it, right? I often call it a double democratic deficit. Many of us live in countries where we're not, truly able to exercise our democratic rights. And then those leaders, often unelected, go and sit around at the UN and other multilateral spaces behind closed doors, completely sort of unaccountable in terms of the decisions they make or don't make on our collective behalf, with little review or checks and balances on that. And so I do think that there's an opportunity to think through how we might reimagine that sort of internationalism. It comes back to the sort of reminder that we also need to nurture those international, cross-border, cross-cultural links. And which is also why I'm a big fan of open democracy and have been a reader and consumer and sometime contributor for what you've been around for about 20 years now, right?
25.
Yeah. And so we need those conversations. We need the awareness. We need the networks of global civic life, of citizens coming together and organizing across borders, if we're going to give ourselves a good chance of delivering a far more democratic global governance system as well.
Danny, last question. What does solidarity mean to you?
I think my sense of solidarity often is taken as, the connections we have and the support we have for people within our group, our community, our nation. That's really important. For me, that solidarity for this phase of human life is about people who aren't necessarily part of your group. As a point I was trying to make, that it's really important that we think about the people who voted for Trump because they were angry about their insecure lives, and the people who hate Trump because of how insecure they feel at the moment. They have so much in common, and solidarity for me is about thinking through those, standing together and building those bridges. And in the same way that, I drink a cup of tea here and I forget that that's the product of backbreaking labor by people who are picking that tea and being paid, I think 1% to 4% of the cost of a price of the tea bag actually finds its way to the people who are. I need to be in solidarity with those people, even though I don't know them, I don't think about them very much. And the more we can do that, again, the better chance we have of fixing the world's woes.
Thank you so much, Danny. It's been a pleasure having you on this.
Thank you. That was great to talk to you.